Chinese girl was forced to wed the mountain man she feared until she found kindness behind his quiet eyes. The notice arrived on a Tuesday, a slip of paper as thin and brittle as the ice forming on the water bucket. Lynn's father, his hands trembling with more than just the winter cold, could not bring himself to read it aloud. She took it from him, her own fingers steady despite the tremor in her heart. The ink was stark against the cheap paper, the words formal and unforgiving. The debt was due. All of it. A sum her father's modest trading post, filled with more dust than goods, could not settle in 10 lifetimes. But the creditor, a man whose name was a shadow whispered in the low-lit corners of the town saloon, offered an alternative, a settlement of a different kind. Lynn's gaze lifted from the paper to her father's defeated face. She knew the name. Everyone did. Rowan Thorne. The man who lived alone on the highest peak of the granite mountains that clawed at the sky. A man who came to town only twice a year. A silent, hulking giant who bought supplies and spoke to no one. They said he was more beast than man, that he'd wrestled a bear for his claim and won. They said his silence was a cage for a terrible rage. The alternative was her. Her father wept, a sound as dry and broken as his cough. "There is no other way, my daughter. He will ruin us. He will take everything." Lynn folded the paper, the sharp creases a mirror of the lines tightening around her own mouth. She was 19. Her world had been the scent of herbs and tea leaves in their small shop, the quiet hum of her mother's sewing machine before she passed, the worn pages of the few books she owned. Now that world was collapsing. She looked at her reflection in the grimy window pane, a pale, determined face framed by dark hair, her thin frame swallowed by an old gray wool dress. The only spot of color on her was the red scarf around her neck, a gift from her mother, its crimson thread a defiant cry against the encroaching gray of her life. "I will do it," she said, her voice small but clear in the quiet room. There was no choice. Pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. Survival was the only currency that mattered now, and she was the price. 2 days later he came. The snow had begun to fall in thick, wet flakes, blurring the hard edges of the world into a soft, sorrowful watercolor. Rowan Thorne did not knock. The door simply opened, and he filled the frame, blocking the weak afternoon light. He was everything the rumors promised and more. A mountain of a man, clad in thick furs and worn leather, with a cascade of dark, untamed hair and a beard that hid the lower half of his face. He was immense, powerful, his presence sucking all the warmth from their tiny room. His eyes, deep-set and shadowed, found hers across the space. They were a startlingly clear gray, like a winter sky just before a storm. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, then at her father, and gave a single, curt nod. It was time. Lynn pulled her red scarf tighter, a flimsy shield against the cold and the man who was now her fate. Her father couldn't meet her eyes as she walked out the door, into the snow, following the silent giant who now owned her life. The journey up the mountain was a silent ordeal, a steep, winding path through snow-laden pines. He moved with an unsettling grace for a man his size, never once looking back to see if she was keeping up. The cold bit at her cheeks, and her breath plumed in the air, the only sound besides the crunch of their boots in the snow. His home was not a cabin, but a large, formidable house built of dark timber and solid stone, looking as if it had grown from the mountain itself. It was isolated, stark, and utterly intimidating. Inside, a fire roared in a massive stone hearth, but the warmth did not reach her. The main room was vast, the ceilings high, the furniture heavy and dark. It felt less like a home and more like a fortress, a place designed to keep the world at bay. He finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "Your room is upstairs, first door on the left." He gestured with his head, already shrugging off his heavy fur coat. "There's food in the pantry, water in the basin. Do not wander outside after dark. The wolves are hungry this time of year." He did not look at her as he said it. His words were not a welcome. They were a list of rules, a statement of facts. Lynn fled up the stairs, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. Her room was simple, clean, but cold. It contained a narrow bed with a thick wool blanket, a small table, and a single window that looked out onto an endless sea of white and gray. She was a prisoner in a silent castle, married to a man who spoke in warnings and looked at her as if she were just another piece of furniture he had acquired. She sat on the edge of the bed, her red scarf still clutched in her hands, and listened to the profound, terrifying silence of the house, broken only by the howling of the wind outside. The first week passed in a state of suspended fear. Lynn existed in the margins of Rowan Thorne's life, a ghost in her own new home. He rose before the sun, and she would hear him moving about downstairs, the heavy tread of his boots a constant reminder of his presence. He would leave for hours, returning covered in snow, carrying firewood or a freshly hunted rabbit. He ate his meals alone at the long wooden table, a silent ritual she watched from the shadows of the staircase. He never summoned her, never demanded anything of her. He simply left a portion of food on the hearth for her, always warm, always enough. This quiet provision was more unnerving than any command. It was a contradiction she couldn't solve. The man was a fearsome brute according to every story, yet he left her untouched, her privacy absolute. Her room was her sanctuary, and he never once approached the stairs while she was up there. One afternoon, driven by a desperate need for something to occupy her mind, she crept downstairs while he was out. The main room was dominated by the hearth, but against one wall was a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf, crammed with books of all kinds. Leather-bound volumes of poetry, worn histories, thick novels. It was the last thing she expected to find. She traced a finger over a title, her starved mind drinking in the possibility. A sound at the door made her snatch her hand back, her heart leaping into her throat. He was back early. He stood there, snow in his beard, his gaze falling on her, then to the bookshelf. She braced herself for anger, for a reprimand. Instead, he just grunted, shaking the snow from his coat. "Read 'em if you want," he rumbled, not looking at her. "They're no good just sitting there." That night she found a book left on the small table by the hearth, placed next to her plate of stew. It was a collection of poems, its cover soft with use. It was not a command, not a gift, but a simple, unspoken permission, a crack in the wall of silence. After a month, the supplies began to run low. "We go to town tomorrow," Rowan announced one evening, his words dropping into the quiet room like stones. The thought of facing the townspeople as Mrs. Thorne sent a fresh wave of dread through Lynn. She had found a strange, fragile peace in the mountain's isolation, in the predictable silence of her husband. To return to the world of whispers and judging eyes felt like a punishment. The journey down was as silent as the first one up, but this time she felt his awareness of her, the subtle way he slowed his pace when the path grew treacherous. The town, Dustfall, was a single muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings, huddled under a perpetually gray sky. As they walked towards the general store, the world seemed to stop. Conversations died. Faces turned. Eyes followed them, a mixture of fear and cruel curiosity. Lynn pulled her red scarf higher, wishing it could make her invisible. She could feel the whispers like insects crawling on her skin. "That's him. Look at her, poor thing. Heard he bought her straight up." Rowan's face was an unreadable mask of stone. He seemed oblivious to the stairs, his focus solely on the task at hand. Inside the trading post, the air was thick with the scent of coffee, leather, and unspoken questions. The proprietor, a woman with sharp eyes and hair pulled into a severe bun, was the only one who met Rowan's gaze directly. "Martha," he grunted in greeting. "Thorne," she replied, her voice dry as dust. "Running low on flour, are you? And your little bride looks like a strong wind could carry her off." Martha's eyes flickered to Lynn, not with pity, but with a frank, assessing curiosity. Lynn flinched, but the woman just gave a wry quirk of her lips. As Rowan listed his needs, Lynn stood by the counter, pretending to examine a bolt of calico. Two women who had been whispering by the pickle barrel drew closer. "They say he killed his last partner over a gold claim," one hissed, loud enough for Lynn to hear. "Just buried him up on that mountain and kept it all." "I heard he speaks to spirits," the other added. "That's why he stays up there. Ain't natural." The words were acid, burning away the tentative comfort Lynn had started to build. She looked at Rowan's broad back, at the raw power in his shoulders. Was he a killer? Was she living in the house of a murderer? The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. When they were done, Martha tallied the bill. As Rowan counted out the coin, she leaned slightly over the counter towards Lynn. "Don't you listen to these gossiping hens," she said in a low, conspiratorial voice. "Half of what they say is fear, the other half is jealousy. That man's got more honor in his silence than this whole town has in its Sunday prayers." Lynn stared at her, surprised by the unexpected defense. Martha just winked. "He ain't the devil, girl. Just complicated." The walk back up the mountain was heavier than before, weighed down by the poison of the town's rumors. The silence in the house that night felt different, no longer peaceful, but charged with unspoken accusations. The town's whispers echoed in the oppressive silence of the house. Lynn watched Rowan by the firelight, his massive form casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The image of him burying a man in the snow played over and over in her mind. Was the quiet of this house the quiet of a tomb? She had to know. She waited until he had finished his meal, her own plate untouched. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the backdrop of the crackling fire. "The people in town," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "they say things about you." He didn't look up from cleaning his knife, his movements methodical and precise. He said nothing, waiting. His stillness was a challenge. "They said that you killed a man." She forced the words out, the accusation hanging in the air between them, ugly and sharp. He stopped his work. The silence stretched, tightening until Lynn thought she might scream. Slowly he lifted his head, and his gray eyes pinned her in place. There was no anger in them, only a deep, weary coldness that seemed to come from the mountain's own frozen heart. "They're not wrong," he said, his voice a low rumble. Lynn's breath hitched. It was true. "His name was Frank Miller," Rowan continued, his gaze distant now, looking into the flames. "He and his brothers thought the claim I'd worked for 5 years was theirs for the taking. They came at me with shovels and threats. I warned them off. They didn't listen." He paused, and the fire crackled, filling the void. Some men don't understand the word no until it's the last one they hear. It was his life or mine. He wasn't boasting. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was stating a fact, as simple and as brutal as the landscape outside their window. He had built his reputation brick by bloody brick because it was the only fence that could protect him. Fear was his shield. His isolation was his armor. He looked back at her, his eyes holding a question he didn't ask aloud. He was letting her judge him. Lynn thought of her father, so easily broken by a piece of paper. Then she looked at this man who had clawed his survival from the rock and fury of this wilderness. It was not a story of murder. It was a story of survival. The fear that had coiled in her stomach began to loosen, replaced by something new, something unsettlingly close to understanding. She picked up her fork and took a bite of the stew he had made. It was still warm. That night something shifted between them. The confession, brutal as it was, had not pushed them further apart. Instead, it had cleared the air of the choking fog of rumor, leaving only a harsh, unvarnished truth. Lynn began to see him not as a monster, but as a man shaped by the unforgiving world he inhabited. She started observing the small things, the way he was gentle with the horses, murmuring to them in a low, soothing tone she never heard him use with people. The calloused, scarred hands that could split a log with one blow could also mend a torn book page with surprising delicacy. A quiet routine formed, no longer governed by fear, but by a shared existence. She would rise and ensure the fire was stoked, putting coffee on to boil. He would return from his morning work and find it waiting, and his silent nod of acknowledgment began to feel less like a dismissal and more like thanks. One afternoon she found him outside by the fence line, working in the biting wind, his bare hands red and raw as he struggled to fix a broken post. Without thinking, she went back inside, brewed a steaming mug of tea, and carried it out to him. She didn't say a word, just held it out. He stopped his work, looking from the mug to her face, a flicker of surprise in his gray eyes. He took it, his large fingers wrapping around the warmth. "Thank you," he rumbled, the words so quiet she almost missed them. It was the first time he had thanked her for anything. Later that week, he noticed her struggling to haul 2 heavy buckets of water from the well. The next day, she woke to find he had constructed a simple pulley system, a clever contraption of rope and wood that made the task effortless. He never mentioned it. He just did it. They began to spend their evenings in the main room together, a silent companionship taking root by the fire. She would read, losing herself in stories of other worlds, and he would sit in his large armchair, oiling his tools or simply staring into the flames, lost in his own thoughts. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a shared presence, a comfortable quiet that spoke of mutual respect. It was a language all its own, and she was finally beginning to understand it. The blizzard arrived without warning, a furious white wall that descended from the peaks and swallowed the world whole. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the very bones of the house. Snow piled in monstrous drifts against the doors and windows, sealing them inside. For the first time, the fortress felt like a trap. On the second night of the storm, a sound like a gunshot echoed through the house. Lynn jolted awake, her heart pounding. Downstairs, she found Rowan already standing in the main room, a lantern held high. A gust of wind and snow blasted through a shattered window pane, the curtains whipping violently. "The old oak!" Rowan shouted over the gale. "A branch must have come down." Together they fought against the storm's intrusion. He wrestled a heavy table over to block the worst of it while she fetched blankets to stuff into the gaps. They worked as a team, moving in instinctive concert, their bodies brushing against each other in the cramped, chaotic space. The cold was brutal, but the shared effort generated its own heat. When at last they had secured a heavy plank over the broken pane, they collapsed, breathless and shivering, in the relative quiet by the hearth. The storm still raged outside, but inside a new kind of stillness had fallen. The emergency had stripped away their layers of silence and caution, leaving them raw and exposed. "You were quick," he said, his voice rough with exertion. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "I'm not as fragile as I look," she replied, her own voice trembling slightly, but not from cold. The firelight played over the strong lines of his face, softening the harsh angles and illuminating the weariness in his eyes. He looked human. He looked lonely. He told her about his family then, about a father who had died chasing gold and a mother who faded soon after. He spoke of the years he had spent utterly alone on this mountain, building this house with his own hands, his only companions the wind and the silence. The fear, he admitted, his gaze fixed on the flames. It was useful. It kept people away. But the quiet, it gets heavy after a while. Lynn saw it all then. The towering strength was a wall built around a hollow place, a fortress designed to protect a profound and aching loneliness. She saw the man, not the myth. On impulse, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. His muscles tensed beneath her touch, but he didn't pull away. He turned his head, his gray eyes searching hers in the flickering light. The space between them became charged, filled with everything they had never said. He slowly raised a hand, his calloused fingers hesitating for a moment before gently touching her cheek. His touch was not rough, but tentative, reverent. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. His lips were soft, hesitant at first, a stark contrast to his rugged appearance. The kiss was not one of possession or demand, but of discovery, a quiet question asked in the heart of the storm. And in her response, she gave him his answer. The blizzard howled outside, but inside the fortress, the walls had finally come down. After the storm broke, the world was reborn in pristine white, the sky a brilliant, aching blue. Inside the house, everything was different too. The silence that returned was not the heavy, anxious quiet of before, but a soft, comfortable stillness, rich with unspoken understanding. They began to talk, the words flowing more easily now that the dam had broken. She told him of her life in the town, of her mother's garden, of her dreams of seeing the ocean. He listened, his intent gaze making her feel as if she were the only person in the world. He started smiling, small, rare things that transformed his severe face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. The first time she saw it, a genuine, unburdened smile, it stole her breath. She began to call him Rowan, the name feeling natural on her tongue. The first time she said it, he stopped what he was doing and simply looked at her, and the warmth in his eyes was more potent than the fire in the hearth. Their days fell into a new rhythm, a dance of partnership. They worked together, mending what the storm had broken, clearing the paths, tending to the horses. She brought her touch to the house, placing a jar of pine boughs on the mantelpiece, rearranging the books, letting more light into the dark corners. It began to feel less like his fortress and more like their home. Their evenings were spent by the fire, but now they often shared a single armchair, her head resting on his shoulder as they read from the same book. The physical intimacy that had begun with a kiss deepened into a tender and patient exploration. He was endlessly gentle, as if he were afraid his own strength might break her. In his arms, Lynn felt not fear, but a profound sense of safety she had never known. He was her shelter, her rock, the calm at the center of the storm. One evening, as she was helping him mend a tear in his shirt, her needle moving deftly, she asked him a question that had been lingering in her mind. "Why me, Rowan? For the debt. There were other ways. You could have just taken the shop." He set down the tool he was sharpening and looked at her, his expression serious. "I saw you," he said, his voice low, "months before, in your father's shop. You were arguing with a man who was trying to cheat him. You weren't afraid of him. You were small, but you stood your ground like a mountain cat. I saw the fire in you." He reached out, his thumb gently tracing her jawline. "I didn't want the shop. I didn't want a servant. I wanted a partner, someone with a spine of steel. The debt, it was just an excuse, a clumsy one." The revelation washed over her, rearranging the past into a new shape. He had not bought a wife. He had chosen one. He had seen her, truly seen her, long before she had ever seen the man behind the myth. When the first signs of spring finally arrived, melting the snow and coaxing tentative green shoots from the frozen earth, it felt like a promise fulfilled. The air grew warmer, carrying the scent of pine and damp soil. Together, they cleared a patch of land near the house for a garden, turning over the rich, dark earth. Rowan worked the soil with his powerful arms, while Lynn followed behind, planting seeds for vegetables and herbs, her fingers sinking into the cool ground. It was an act of hope, of putting down roots in the place that had once been her prison. They were building a future, one seed at a time. The physical and emotional space between them had vanished completely. They moved as one, their lives intertwined. He would often stop his work just to watch her, a look of quiet wonder on his face. She, in turn, found a deep and abiding joy in his presence, in the steady, reliable beat of his heart next to hers, in the quiet of the night. Her red scarf, once a symbol of defiance and a memory of a life lost, now lay on the dresser in their room. She no longer needed its flimsy protection. Her safety was in his arms. Her home was in his heart. The day came when they needed to go back to Dustfall for supplies. The thought no longer filled Lynn with dread, but with a quiet resolve. As they prepared to leave, Rowan hesitated at the door. "You don't have to come," he said, his eyes searching hers. "I can face them alone." She smiled, reaching up to smooth a stray lock of his long hair. "They are not just your whispers to face anymore," she said softly. "They're ours." He took her hand, his large fingers enveloping hers, and they walked down the mountain path together, not as a monster and his captive, but as husband and wife. The bond between them was a tangible thing, a quiet strength that emanated from their linked hands. Spring had not only come to the mountain, it had bloomed, fierce and beautiful, in the once lonely fortress of his heart. The town of Dustfall was unchanged. The same muddy street, the same gray sky, the same curious, judgmental eyes. As Rowan and Lynn walked towards the trading post, the whispers started again, a familiar, venomous hum. But this time, Lynn did not flinch. She did not hide her face behind her scarf. She walked with her head held high, her hand held securely in her husband's. The townspeople stared, their expressions shifting from morbid curiosity to outright confusion. They had expected to see a broken, terrified girl. They saw instead a woman, poised and serene, standing beside the mountain man not as a possession, but as an equal. Inside the store, Martha was behind the counter as always. Her sharp eyes took in the sight of them, their joined hands, the easy confidence in Lynn's posture. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face. "Well, look at that," she said, her voice laced with dry approval. "Spring has finally come to the mountain." While Rowan conducted his business, Lynn moved through the store with a newfound purpose. She bought seeds for her garden and a bolt of bright blue cloth, the color of the post-storm sky. The women who had whispered rumors before now fell silent as she approached, their gazes dropping to the floor. Her calm defiance was a shield they could not penetrate. As they were leaving, a man stumbled out of the saloon, emboldened by drink. "Thorne!" he called out, his voice slurring. "Still hiding up there with what ain't yours?" Rowan stopped, his body tensing, the old, dangerous stillness falling over him. But before he could react, Lynn stepped forward slightly, placing herself at his side. She looked the man directly in the eye, her gaze clear and unwavering. "He is my husband," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying with absolute certainty. "And this mountain is our home." The man, taken aback by her directness, simply blinked and shuffled away, his drunken courage failing him. Rowan looked down at her, his expression a mixture of awe and a fierce, protective love that made her heart swell. He didn't need to use fear as his shield anymore. They were each other's armor now. They walked away from the town, leaving the whispers and the judgment behind them in the dust. The path back up the mountain felt different this time. Not a retreat, but a homecoming. The sun broke through the clouds, casting long golden rays through the pine trees. Looking up at the formidable house that waited for them on the peak, Lynn no longer saw a fortress or a prison. She saw the place where she had found the truth behind a fearsome reputation, where kindness had blossomed in the harshest winter, and where a man with quiet eyes had given her a love as vast and as solid as the mountains themselves.